Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. And today we're doing a live stream to talk about contemplating on what William Winston said in his translation, commentaries on the translation that he did on Josephus when he translated it into English. I read the testimonium and I read these other things in Josephus. It makes it sound like that he was a Christian. And recently, I finally released the debate I filmed months ago, earlier this year. The debate between Professor James Charlesworth and Dr. Richard Carrier. And basically, it was about did Josephus mention did he mention Jesus? Did he write the testimonium? And close to the end of last year, I hosted a debate between James Valliant and Dr. Richard Carrier on the same topic. So that's the reason why I called the debate between Charlesworth and Carrier Episode 2, because it is covering the same thing, basically. Now, the arguments were similar, but there were some differences. Charlesworth argues from the Agapius Arabic testimonium that this looks like pretty much what Josephus would have written, while Carrier claims it actually has been proven to descend from Eusebius, so it's not evidence that Josephus mentioned Jesus. But Charlesworth brings up the James passage, that it refers back to the testimonium, which is something that Bart Ehrman has said, but it's something also that James Valliant here has said many times. So Charlesworth was baffled because to him it made no sense that how could you have the James passage but not have the testimonium at all? But then that takes me to the Slavonic Josephus. In the Slavonic Josephus, there's a 2-paragraph version of the testimonium that we find in the Antiquities. It is called the Testimonium Slavianum by scholars. And it says a lot of things that one might find strange. That, for example, Pilate was the one that was paid 30 talents, not Judas Iscariot, or 30 shekels. Pilate was paid 30 talents to let the Jews execute Jesus.
I'll be back.
And not only that, Jesus appears to Pilate twice. And the first time he gets released, but the next time he gets executed. I'm like, okay, well that suggests that the Barabbas story and the Christ story, or the Jesus Christ and Jesus Barabbas, were originally, or at least in some form, the same person. And that's what the Slavonic Josephus insinuates. And we know that no Christian sect in any century believed that those two characters are the same person, which would I'll shut up in a minute. I'm just saying this real quick. It would I'm trying to remember. What's the word I'm looking for? It would complicate any argument that it's a complete interpolation. Why would a Christian insert such a thing into the text? Not only that, but the contradict the Judas Iscariot story, or at least appear to, and then claim, because in the Testimony of Slavianum it claims that Jesus' followers were rebels, and they wanted Jesus to kill Pilate and kill the Romans, and to free Jerusalem from Roman control. That's what the Testimony of Slavianum says. So, like I was saying earlier, no Christian could have completely interpolated. So, James, what is your reaction?
Liran, you're
really loud.
James, your voice is very low. Could you?
My voice is low?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Oh dear. I'll try to speak up, I guess, a little bit. To set a little context here, what we mean by the Slavonic edition of Josephus, we mean a copy of what appears to be a copy of uh, uh, the Jewish Wars by Josephus, his work written 20 years before the Antiquities, the work that we know him to have mentioned John the Baptist, James, and reportedly Jesus in the Testimonium. This is the Jewish Wars, his much earlier work. And it is a 14th century old Russian manuscript. That's as old as it is, and that's the language we find it in. And it appears to be an abbreviated version, although too extensive probably to be a mere epitome. It appears to be an abbreviated version of the Jewish Wars, but it has a reference to Jesus that contradicts the gospel account, as you just outlined. It clearly contradicts all four gospels when it talks about Pilate giving him a release before rearresting him because he got the 30 units of silver, whatever those are, talents of silver.
Second.
He got the 30 units of silver rather than Judas. And so in major ways, it contradicts the gospels. And it is more naked in its assertion that John the Baptist is a rebel, and it is far more naked in its assertion that Jesus' followers were rebels. And so Josephus has, if this is original, Josephus has not yet completed what would be a fuller whitewashing of John the Baptist, James, and Jesus, as he would say in the Antiquities, if it's true. If it's true. Now, the issue was debated by scholars much earlier, almost 100 years ago now, starting in the 1920s and 30s. Professor Eisler wrote vast work just on what he believed to be that this was the authentic Aramaic version of Josephus' Jewish Wars. In the preface to the Greek version, Josephus tells us he wrote an Aramaic version of this and sent it to the East. Professor Eisler, around 1930, argued extensively that it was just exactly that what we have is the Aramaic version. Now, that was very vigorously argued against by scholars of his time. Some of them very vigorously argued against.
And I think if I can butt in there for a moment, one of the things that seems to demonstrate Eisler's point that I found in the Slavonic edition, the preface in book 1 is missing. And I remember showing this to you, James, in a private conversation. Practically the entire preface is missing, and that's the part where it mentions that where Josephus should have mentioned he sent a previous work to the East in his language, in the language of the barbarians. Now, the way I respond to such a scenario is, well, Josephus is referring back to the Slavonic version, which is the Aramaic version, when he wrote the Greek Wars of the Jews. Because in the Greek Wars of the Jews, it makes mention in the preface that he wrote a previous work to the East, written in the language of the barbarians, which is Aramaic.
Presumably, it lacked that very preface, right?
Yeah. Well, it's not just that, but there's something else. I guess maybe I'll just say a bunch of more things on this than I previously planned here. There's something significant in Jewish Wars 2:19-2 in that section of the Slavonic version. The deaths of Monobazus and Canidius are missing. And I think that's very significant because remember the Adiabeni, this is where Monobazus and Canidius came from. That's beyond the Euphrates in the Middle East. That's Josephus. That's the audience of the Slavonic edition. Their deaths are not mentioned. But in the Greek version, their deaths are mentioned. So it looks like what Josephus wanted to avoid.
And that would be significant politically because they were the ones in rebellion.
Rebel scum.
And so, therefore, the fact that it was left out would have been to appease the politics of this Eastern Kingdom.
Could you try to speak up more, James? I can still.
In other words, the fact that this was left out of the Slavonic edition is suggestive that it's the Aramaic version because these two characters joined the rebellion. And so it would have been to politically appease the very audience to which he'd sent the Aramaic version. Is that what you're arguing?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's why I said it's significant that Manabazes and Candidius are missing there.
It appears
Now,
he's their
here's the
people.
problem, at least for others arguing against Josephus mentioning Jesus. If they can, if people were to concede, if people disputing the testimonium conceded that the Slavonic edition is the Aramaic edition, then what they're saying is Josephus actually mentioned Jesus a lot earlier than they thought. That would mean the James passage is really the third reference to Jesus. The Testimonium is the second reference to Jesus, the Testimonium Flavianum. And the Slavianum is the original. So that means Josephus has clearly a historical Jesus, indisputably.
You have stories of Jesus and Pilate and John the Baptist within Josephus at roughly the same time that the Gospel of Mark is traditionally dated in the 70s, which is an
I want to show the audience this real
absolute
quick.
fact if true.
Oh my god, it's invisible. Never mind.
This is my copy of the Slavonic Josephus. It's a synoptic comparison. What that means is that the editors of this book, H. Lemming and K. Lemming and L. Osinkana. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. This book has the Greek version on the right and the Slavonic version on the left. And anyone that has this book can go through it and see the startling differences between the Slavonic version and the Greek version.
Well, as I say, it appears to be longer than a mere outline or epitome. You know, traditionally scholars who would be reading ancient sources would leave us their summary, what we call epitomes of this earlier work that they've written. So it has been proposed that something like the Slavonic edition might simply be a medieval epitome of Judaism. But in my view, it appears to be longer and more detailed than most epitomes, and yet it is an abbreviated version. I guess what you might expect from an earlier edition. It leaves out, as you point out, certain things that might be politically uncomfortable for Rome's allies in the East, which is also interesting considering Josephus's audience. So
Yeah.
you at least make me interested. The point, though, being is where is the earlier Aramaic version of the Jewish Wars? Is it only existing in this form? Or could it? The arguments are complex and many. Some people say it's only these bits about Jesus that are, in fact, added. Some people say the bits about Jesus and John the Baptist are the only bits that are added because of later Christian theology. But you make a good point. They contradict the Gospels.
Well, and another thing is, if the arguments that the Testimony of Flavianum is a forgery would enter a circular loop if one were to admit the Slavonic version is authentic. And the thing is, a typical argument that scholars make about the Slavonic version is, oh, it's a Serbian forgery in the early second millennium AD.
Why would the Serbians make a forgery?
I don't know. Like that, the arguments make no sense to me.
There are lots and lots of Christian forgeries. I'm confident that the correspondence between Seneca and Paul is a late Christian forgery. We have different versions of Josephus that were rewritten by Christians just for the medieval audience, the famous Josephon. Christians were happy to tamper with their earlier sources, especially ones they relied upon heavily like Josephus. It shows you how heavily, and this is the context to bear in mind, Josephus is heavily relied upon by Christians throughout the early Christian, from Eusebius forward. Josephus is of enormous importance to Christians, and that makes him a suspicious source to, enhance for your own purposes, I suppose. But it also indicates that they are preserving Josephus. So the absence of any form of the Aramaic edition is a lacuna in a way.
So here's the thing, and when it comes to Paul and Seneca, that's a different situation, because the Paul and Seneca text contradicts the not only does it contradict the Pauline epistles, the chronology in there is all messed up. Also, we had other Christians called Paul, like Maros Paulet in the 2nd century. Actually, there was a Bishop Seneca in the 2nd century too. A lot of people don't know about that. So the thing is, it's a forgery like the doctrine of Addai is. I've never been the doctrine of Addai. And the thing is, it briefly mentions the Trinity in the Paul and Seneca version, which is not in the Slavonic version.
Which
The
is clear,
Slavonic,
that's the 4th century date.
yeah, the
right?
Slavonic Josephus doesn't have those problems
Right,
at all,
right.
not even close.
See, that's another thing. Eisler argued that it appears to be pre-gospel and and sort of still wrestling with early Christian issues. Well, it kind of does. It contradicts the Gospels. What later Christian would invent a story that so contradicts the Gospels?
They wouldn't.
That's a fair question, it seems to me.
So the thing is, there's no Serbian theology in this text, and the text as it is makes no sense to forge.
It augments, from what I can see, it seems to. It has, for example, Pilate's wife playing an important role, and one that isn't echoed in other Christian literature. She's healed by him. And one of the differences between the Western and Eastern churches is the status of Pilate and his wife. So a greater focus on Pilate and his wife that we see here might be consistent.
Well, yes, it is consistent with the rest of it, because this text, the Pilate's wife story comes from the East, and this text is in the East, was sent to the East, so that doesn't contradict anything I'm saying.
In fact, the causal argument you're saying might go the other way about.
Yes.
Namely, that this tradition in the Aramaic version of...
Here's the other issue. If we say it's a forgery, because if we say it's a forgery, hold on, let me finish this thought. If we say it's a forgery because Pilate's wife is in there, by the way, she's not named in this version. I mean, this text at all, actually. That I remember. The text, then decides. Think about this. Everything else in there contradicts the Gospels practically, except that. So why would a Christian decide, okay, let me put Pilate's wife there, but then let's contradict the Gospels everywhere else? 30 talents, Jesus' brothers and Christ are the same guy. 30 talents to Pilate, not to Judas Iscariot.
The way it could work is that because this version of Josephus was only preserved in the East, that's what informed the Eastern tradition that gave Pilate.
That's my argument.
Yeah. Also, when Pilate healed his wife said, "Honey, I don't want to. I have a headache."
I mean, I don't know.
You never know.
But there, I am a skeptic walking in the door about everything, and
so you said it was translated in the 14th century.
Well, what we have is a 14th century old Russian manuscript.
Yes, Kevin. I think what happened is it could have been because of the Crusades that they found an Aramaic version of Josephus that the Serbs had translated into Slavonic. That's what it looks like. But the point that I've been making to James lately is that there is no evidence of Serbian theology at all. You can look as long as you want about Josephus, you'll never find it. So the argument is Serbs forged it to fight the Khazars. Like, what?
And you said it. How does it describe Jesus? You said he was from like a rebel cult or something.
Yeah, he had followers. He had followers that were described as terrorists, basically, that wanted Jesus to kill Pilate and the Romans, and he refused to do it.
So does he mention the sects of Judaism with the Zealots and stuff?
In the Slavonic version, the rebels are there. He covers the war, the events in the Jewish war.
Remember, very famously, Josephus has two very different descriptions of the sects that are between just the known Greek editions of the Jewish war and the Antiquities. He switches, for example, the roles of the Essenes and the Pharisees, but he gives a generalized description in both works of all three sects.
And that's the reason. See, all these things are reasons why I don't see the problem. And James, of course, there's one thing I want to say here to address what you were saying. I'm not asking you not to be a skeptic. Why would I say that?
Never, Jacob. You're always fair about that.
But the thing is, I'm the one being skeptical of the scholarly claims being made about it, because the burden of proof should go on them for claiming this is a forgery, not the other way around. And the Slavonic Josephus makes and you know this, James. I showed you is this. There's no Khazarian or Serbian theology anywhere in this text.
I looked and I couldn't find anything that, apart from Pilate and his wife, and as I say, the causality may work just the other way around on it, right?
Yeah, Pilate and the wife thing isn't enough.
I don't think.
Yeah.
But what I
It's like
look at is look, I do not know Old Russian. And I would
no, I
not,
know plenty of old Russians.
there are people who make linguistic arguments against Eisler, and I honestly have to do research on what they say and background research on what they say before I
Sure.
even have a semi-informed opinion. It seems to me worth
But
stating.
remember, there are often scholars will also say they'll turn that around and say, well, grammar or linguistic arguments aren't always really, they don't always hold a lot of meat. Uh, they'll say, well, actually, if the text is missing from a manuscript, or if we're talking about interpolations, because sometimes I was like, well, maybe it. I think there are some scholars that will say, well, it's essentially authentic. I think someone said that. I don't remember.
Well, I think
But it's interpolated,
more
heavily
often than
interpolated.
not, content arguments will win over, and they should. Just in most cases, in most contexts, content it prevails over linguistic arguments anyway. But remember, the linguistic arguments are always a little bit circular because we use ancient texts to determine contemporary language.
Oh yeah.
So if someone
Yeah.
says, well, this is an original Josephus. Well, wait a minute here. How are you saying that? Well,
Do you have the original Josephus?
right. That's what we're just determining. Is this original?
Yeah.
That came up in the carrier debates very often.
Well, here's the other thing. Let's get into the grammar argument involving the testimony of Flavianum. Luke Acts. Well, the interpolator used Luke and squeezed him into Josephus. Now, I believe I did a live stream with Dr. Price recently talking about that. Yes, I did. And we talked about the Slavonic Josephus, and he actually thinks the Slavonic Josephus is authentic.
Dr. Price.
He finds yes.
Yeah.
And I tried to ask Dr. Price this question, like, okay, if the testimony of Slavianum is authentic, is it just me, or does it seem a little self-defeating to argue the testimony of Flavianum can't be then?
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
the other thing is
Slavonic edition, which has a version of the testimonium, mind you, with similar language.
the other thing that bothers me about the arguments that the testimonium isn't fully authentic, or is partially authentic, or not authentic at all, is that okay? Well, it's on the basis of Luke. Well, okay, I guess it does resemble Luke in language. The arguments seem to be solid there, but that only seems to me to be the case because, well, I think the simpler explanation is Luke used the testimonium. Now, Dr. Steve Mason tends to think that Luke used Josephus, but at the same time, Steve Mason did mention he postulated another possibility. He seems to lean more towards Luke used Josephus, though. But in another case, he said, well, I guess one could claim Luke is before Josephus, which I think that argument doesn't hold any water, in my opinion, my humble opinion. I think Luke using Josephus makes a lot more sense, and Steve Mason seems to think that way too.
The language argument and the arguments that are being used by now multiple scholars are that Luke is dependent on Josephus. So what the interpolation of the testimonium argument goes is something like this: Josephus wrote, Luke used Josephus, and then Luke was used to create language to interpolate Josephus with. So you're right. There is kind of an Occam's razor that
Exactly. That's the point I'm making. Like, okay, so you're saying, so basically what we're saying is, paper B copied paper A, and then paper C that copied paper B used paper B to interpolate paper A.
Sort of a spiral of influences.
Yeah, and that I'm like, okay, has that ever happened in history? That just sounds really, really weird.
James, if that was a type of argument in court, is there any judge who would say?
That's what I asked James in a private conversation. Was that ever argued in the courtroom?
It would. I've never had a documentary evolution argument in court quite like that. So I'm not sure I can give you a comparison. But it does seem strange that the very source that uses Luke is claimed to be the source of used by Luke. Josephus is the second source that's used to modify Josephus that Luke used. Maybe if the best I can do there is maybe if the interpolators knew that Luke used Josephus and relied on Josephus, they would use Luke to interpolate Josephus with. If they were aware, for example, of Matthew and Luke using, there'd be a very neat little argument, I guess you could make. They were aware that Matthew and Luke were reliant on Josephus, if that's the case, because the so-called Christ seems to be Matthean, and the rest of it seems to have a lot of Lucan language. If they can say that, then they can say, oh, well, you see, we need to mine those guys to create the interpolated text.
Yeah. But yeah, with respect, I still think that makes no sense to me. I think Luke using Josephus makes it less likely that someone used Luke to interpolate Josephus, which would mean I would require more evidence.
Let's look at one of Carrier's arguments, which I think is a two-edged sword. He observes that all the manuscripts that we know of, and then he even includes his argument about Agapius, as you mentioned earlier. He says literally, and we do have a lot of ancient manuscripts of Josephus. Ancient manuscripts go, we got a whole bunch of medieval and Byzantine kind of manuscripts, sourced manuscripts of Josephus. They all have the testimonium as Eusebius quotes it. So Carrier makes the argument that, when the interpolation happened, they wiped out everything else, the pre-interpolation Josephus, and very thoroughly, because all of our known manuscripts, and we have a bunch, contain the testimonium with all the bells and whistles. They found Agapius, which is, and he says, he's with the argument that says even those are dependent on our post-Eusebius version. Well, if that's the case, then all of our ancient manuscripts have the testimonium as is. That's a two-edged sword there, Professor Carrier. It could mean that the testimonium simply is authentic to Josephus. Surely something would have snuck through that's not part. If you claim it's interpolated, then where is this non-interpolated manuscript? Anywhere, in any form.
Yeah, we don't have one, do we?
By his own argument, we don't have one. Carrier is the first to say all of our existent manuscripts are the post-Eusebian version. Well, then what evidence do we have? Say apart, and this is the question I asked Carrier in the debate, which I will ask now rhetorically. Apart from Origen's description of Josephus, what evidence for any interpolation would there be? How could we say at all that the testimonium is interpolation absent Origen? And recall that Carrier's argument is that Origen was mistaken. He wasn't actually reading Josephus, he was reading Hegesippus.
How could he? And if he didn't read Josephus, though, then how could he confuse him with Hegesippus?
And then why do we have any argument against the testimonium? Because unless Origen was actually reading Josephus, then his Josephus didn't believe in Jesus as the Christ falls apart.
But the best way I can understand Carrier's argument is that, okay, he read Josephus at one point, later he read Hegesippus, or maybe he was reading both of them at the same time, and he came to the conclusion, I guess by mistake, that Hegesippus's James passage was the one in Josephus. And he misremembered which one belonged where.
To get me to the full-on testimonium, one of two things I think has to occur. One is I'll have to change my view that I was arguing vociferously against Dr. Carrier about. Namely, Origen was reading the wrong text. He was mistaking Josephus for something else. That, of course, would destroy all the evidence, the only real evidence we have of interpolation. Right?
Yeah.
And because absent Origen, we believe that the testimonium is at all an interpolation, and that Origen was actually reading Josephus. Absent. Now, the other possibility, of course, is that Origen hadn't read all of Josephus. He might have only read the sections with John the Baptist and James. He might not have read the testimonium at all. He may have been just a sloppy scholar in the sense that he was basing it all on the James passage without having read the testimonium at all.
My original argument to you about that was, I think Origen, he read a scroll of Antiquities 20, but he never, not a scroll of Antiquities 18.
And in the 3rd century AD, when you went into a library and read a book, you would be given a series of scrolls, separate scrolls, all of which you would have to read through separately. And it is quite possible, and we have other examples of it, of ancient authors citing an author they had not fully read. So that's possible. Or it's possible Carrier is right. Maybe Origen wasn't reading Josephus. He mistook Josephus for Hegesippus. And if that's correct, then, as I pointed out to Professor Carrier, he didn't fully accept the conclusion there, then why should I believe that there's...
Yeah, Dr. Carrier, he was never a professor.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Dr. Carrier, yeah, that might be difficult too. Anyway, Dr. Carrier, if you're right, if Josephus is not being quoted by Origen, if Origen is mistaken about reading Josephus, then you've taken away from me the only real evidence I have that the testimonium was in interpolation.
Yeah, I currently don't see how, because like the James passage, he's so specific about the James passage, as you and I both agree on. The James passage, he specifically describes it so well. He had to have been talking about Josephus.
Right.
In fact, I suggest, although I'm not going to get into my full argument here right now, I'm just going to give a brief intro to it to the audience. There's evidence that James, I think, in Josephus was confused for another character in Josephus by Origen, rather than another text. But I'll talk about that another time. That's a little...
Well, as I said, what you just said there plugs into an argument I did make with Carrier. The blaming James for the destruction of Jerusalem and the war that would come is a classic Josephine kind of argument. Josephus makes that kind of argument many places, ascribes the cause of the fall of Jerusalem to many causes. He has a complex set of etiologies. You know, it was the...
I think so.
Yeah. It was this, it was Judas the Galilean, it was the death, you know, boom, boom, boom. And so he blamed and lots of events for the Jewish war. And it could be that it's being classic Josephine logic, Origen is just simply making the inference that Josephus made that argument. Or it could be that that bit was taken out when the interpolation happened. But if I don't believe that the interpolation is an interpolation,
another thing I'll say,
then I'll just say that Origen was probably assuming that Josephus made that argument. The reason why I don't think it was a confusion is that Origen doesn't tell us all the details Hegesippus tells us about the James death, the Fuller's Club, and so forth. I mean, if Origen was really talking about the Hegesippus version, he would have included uniquely Hegesippan details that are absent from James.
Yeah.
He does not. He does
That
not.
makes sense.
And furthermore, Hegesippus no more makes the causal argument about James than Josephus does. So I don't even understand why Carrier has a leg to stand on there. He says, well, you can see he makes the James causal argument. That means it's not Josephus, it's Hegesippus. Well, you can read Hegesippus, or at least and Eusebius tells us this is the full Hegesippus that he gives us on James. This is all that Hegesippus wrote about James, says Eusebius. And there's nowhere a similar causal argument. So I have no reason to believe the confusion that he's suggesting in the first place. Hegesippus doesn't make that argument, Carrier. And Hegesippus gives us details which Origen's description of Josephus does not give us. And so I'm more inclined to believe that Origen, for those reasons, I'm more inclined to believe that Origen only read, if the testimonium wasn't interpolated, that must imply that Origen only read one part of the Antiquities, which is, as he said, written in 20 books.
Now, speaking on that about ignorance of text, some probably are curious. Well, the Slavonic Josephus existed. If the Slavonic Josephus is the Aramaic Josephus, and if it had everything that I say it had in there, then why wouldn't Christians quote the testimony of Slavionum? Well, my argument is when Josephus entered to the East, it became lost, and
the Gospels.
So the first 1400 years, Christians didn't have the text. After I think the Gospels would have copied from them, it got lost, and then when it was rediscovered in the early second millennium AD, it was translated into Slavonic.
I would be willing to believe that the Aramaic version somehow found its way into a Byzantine library. It may have been before the Crusades, but I think you make a really good suggestive argument that since it appeared in the 14th century, that it may have been a discovery of the Crusaders at Edessa. And that makes sense given where it is.
It looks that way to me. I mean, it was sent to them.
Sent the Aramaic edition, right? And so again, that dovetails with that neatly. But whenever it was discovered, whether it was discovered earlier by a Byzantine scholar in the East, it was not promoted in the West and would not be promoted in the West because it contradicts the Gospels. No Christian from the 3rd or 4th century on would have any interest in the Slavonic edition, which flatly contradicts all 4 Gospels, both in the Pilate release, the 30 units going to Pilate, Jesus' disciples being so nakedly rebels who wanted to overthrow the Roman government, John the Baptist being having a different age, being set back so much earlier than the Gospels do, and being so nakedly a rebel. Indeed, if I'm to believe that this is original Josephus, as I say, I would have to believe that Josephus has not yet finished the whitewashing that we clearly see in the Antiquities of John the Baptist, which was completely toned down.
Exactly, that's what I think.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. Yes.
Guys, okay, so I have to say something. Do you remember when you started talking and you mentioned that the differences in who sold out Jesus for 30 shekels and I had to leave? Well, I have good news. I found 30 shekels, and it's not just any 30 shekels. It's the original 30 shekels used to buy off, or to sell off Jesus. So you see, here's a, one sec. You see, here's the money. Oh.
There. It'd be like an anti-relic, though. You see? Like the Holy Grail or something, or the Spear of Longinus or something, or the, Sword of Destiny. It would be an evil thing full of evil spirits, and the 30 pieces of silver that those evil priests gave.
Well, one of these I put into a vending machine to give me a Coca-Cola, and it didn't give me the Coca-Cola. Even worse, it gave me a Pepsi once.
You're using those.
So this is really. So you might have a point there. These shekels might be cold. Now, I did some.
Shekels, man, that's bad karma.
I did some research, and I found out what 30 shekels can get you. And the thing, you get a Coca-Cola and a falafel. Now that might mean inflation, or the fact that Jesus wasn't valued as high. So in the antiquity, Jesus was worth the same equivalency as a Coca-Cola and falafel. Now, wait, now,
I'm hungry. A Coca-Cola and a falafel. Exactly what the doctor ordered. I don't know.
Now you might say there's a problem. You might say there's a time-wise problem with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, yes. How do you know Jesus wasn't the person making the falafel and the Coca-Cola?
I guess that would work if there was any historical backing to the Terminator Jesus story.
And actually, I have a solution for you. I know a falafel place that they never change the oil, and the oil is so old it's basically a fossil fuels at this point. It wasn't.
Why did they
didn't
never
use.
change it?
They're fucking cheap.
Oh,
Anyways,
okay,
they're really cheap. So you might say it's fossil fuels. No, it's not fossil fuels because they use fossil fuels to do it directly. They were just fossils that started growing in the oil.
Sounds like it's toxic waste at this point.
Well, I can tell you that was the very falafel that the guys who sold out Jesus used to go eat there. Now, all we need to do is go there and ask him, have you ever sold a falafel to this person at this point in time? I'm sorry, I can't do this stick anymore. It was fun, but we got to keep talking about serious stuff.
30 units of silver, 30 talents of silver was a
fortune. Isn't it shekels?
30. Well,
in the Slavonic it says talents.
Talents.
No, that's impossible. Like
metal.
That's a small fortune.
Small fortune 2,000 years ago. And
yeah, it's a small fortune today if you look at the price of silver.
Yeah. But
what's the price of silver? I think it's $1,500 a talent. $1,500 a talent.
Right, and bribes in those days were customary, and locals. One of the ways in which Roman governors got rich is judicial bribes from the locals, all the time.
Yep. If anybody lived in Eastern Europe or China, same deal.
There's even a reference in the book of Acts that sort of, when Paul was under arrest, the officials at the time sort of expected a bribe from his friends that never materialized in time, as if that was standard practice, right?
He's not even giving a bribe. That's like the utmost type of rudeness. I can't believe he didn't give me a bribe. Can you believe the utter criminal arrogance of this man?
Well, but back to seriousness. These flat contradictions of all four gospels are something to worry about, aren't they? I mean, there may be, and this has been an argument that's been made against Eisler's arguments, for this being the Aramaic, Slavonic translation of the original Aramaic version of the Jewish wars, has been that, well, these may have been people proud of their unorthodox views and their weird views, and that's exactly what they were doing, is putting forth heretical views. But that's how far they have to kind of go in making their arguments against Eisler. They have to say, in fact, that whoever these interpolators were, they were kind of unconventional, unorthodox, and they were putting their heterodox views in there on purpose. Of course, back in the 14th century, that was deadly dangerous to do. I mean, literally dangerous to do.
Well, I wonder what's going on with the astrology in the 14th century in Russia, and maybe they were trying to recreate the history to start their own cult or something. And I think that would happen all the time.
They were
Maybe behind the scenes.
You know, the conversion of Russians to Christianity did not happen until the 900s by Byzantine missionaries, right? People like Cyril, who gave them their alphabet.
Cyril and Methodius gave them their alphabet. That's why we call it the Cyrillic alphabet.
Liran, you get extra credit.
Oh no, everybody who speaks a bit of Russian knows that.
But it was Byzantine priests who brought Greek culture north of Black Sea into Russia and Ukraine, converted the people of Kiev and so forth, and
Belarus.
And then it is also absolutely true that in the 12 and 1300s and 1400s, when the Byzantine Empire was utterly collapsing and in its death throes, right? Because by around 1450 it would be gone completely to the Ottoman Turks. The Russians had to develop, through the course of these centuries, these very centuries, had to develop their own church, their own Eastern Orthodox Church, which would, of course, become the Russian Orthodox Church.
Slavic Church, that's its name.
So, no, Kevin makes a really outstanding point that at this very time in history, the Russians were seeking self-identification in their own kind of Christianity. The problem is, of course, that even the Russian Orthodox Church accepts canonical truth of the four Gospels.
Oh, right.
Well, yeah, and like I make that point because I had a friend tell me recently that Flavian means golden, and I was researching.
It means blonde.
The Corona Australis, and doesn't
it mean blonde?
Yeah, blonde or golden or yellow or whatever.
So yellow, I think, is actually probably the more multi-use proper translation, because you've got the word gold or golden, aurea or aureus. That means gold with stuff in the ground, and it can refer to the color too.
Yeah. Well, even the word flay is kind of has the word flame in it.
And that's what you'd call, Liran's correct in that sense. That's what you'd call a blonde in ancient Rome, right? The word.
Even the symbol of blonde hair, though, it goes back to India with the hair was the rays of the sun, or in the 7 braids of Samson.
Only very few blonde people have color that is the color of the sun. Most blonde people, it looks. Yeah. Only very few blonde people have blonde hair that's the color of the sun, though.
But yeah, like Samson in the Bible, he has the 7 braids of hair, and then you have that comes from that cult where the rays of God or the 7 rays of the sun are the 7 braids of hair.
I think that's what it is.
And so then you see the Romans calling the Corona Australis this constellation. They call it the Golden Crown, and that was mentioned by this Patrick Moore guy, and so.
I have a different theory about that.
Oh?
Okay, so, Titus Flavius was the Messiah, right?
Right.
And he was a blonde, supposedly.
Oh, Vespasian?
Yeah, Vespasian. I mean, his name is Blondie. No?
His father and his grandfather and all his cousins were named Blondie in that sense. So
okay, good enough for me. Now, David was a redhead, right?
He was blonde.
David was a redhead. That's clearly stated. Admoni, which means ready.
Right. Homeric heroes are called redheads.
Now, I contend that they wanted to create a red-headed Messiah, a blonde Messiah, and a black-haired Messiah so they can make a boy band.
Oh, that's cheesy. I'm
But
not.
that's
I'm not
all different parts of the season, the year.
Never
No.
because of my stupid jokes.
giving heroes striking or unusual hair colors may have symbolic meaning in ancient literature.
Nobody cares about my stupid jokes.
No, but it seems to be a strange thing that Homer sometimes tells us about the red hair or the blonde hair of a hero, and that's striking.
I mean, is it striking that he describes Hera as ox-eyed Hera?
She was the cow goddess. She was
No, she just had those type of eyes. I mean,
originally a lunar moon goddess.
No, she just had pretty eyes.
But like the Son of Man is called, as said, to wearing a golden crown in the Book of Revelation.
Right.
So I kind of see this connection to this sort of
golden
sun god astrology in Josephus, and I wonder how symbolic his even destruction of Jerusalem is.
Golden crown is, of course, very interesting because Caesars wore wreaths, golden wreaths,
Yeah.
and in fact, as a symbol of office eventually, but originally it was Julius Caesar. You know, they had these military decorations, and the top military decorations were wreaths of various kinds. Some of them were just, and different plants were used depending on the kind of award you got in the military army. If you saved a fellow soldier, you get one kind of award. If you saved the whole army, you got the higher award. If you
How can you save the whole army?
There can be heroic deeds. You know, you come in and
a whole army. Well, you could spot an ambush. That will do it.
To provide cavalry's backup to something that saves the whole army. Yeah, you can save the whole army if you're an officer, and if you're the first the enemy wall during a siege, you got what was known as the mural crown, right?
I think we're starting to go like far off topic.
Yeah, maybe.
I think let's just give our final thoughts on the Slavonic Josephus, and then we can end our talk for the day.
My final thought is you have fascinated me and interested me to the point, Jacob, that I'm going back to Eisler and I'm going back to those linguistic critics of his to go do my homework. You know me, I'm a skeptic, and you have to move heaven and earth to move my opinion. And I will have to be convinced, but you've intrigued me. You've certainly intrigued me. What later Christian really would put these things that contradict the gospel so flatly in a late forgery? That's an interesting question. Could this be at least a version? Or, some people have argued that it is the Aramaic version, but it's got these later Christian interpolations. And so I want to look at all those arguments, especially the linguistic ones, because I am no expert on this very area. I mean, from Aramaic into Slavonic is above my pay grade.
I have a question. Do you think there was a Hebrew edition of the Josephus's works?
Because the lingua franca of Levant time was Aramaic, not Hebrew.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't make sense. If he would make one in Hebrew, it would only be targeted for Jews. But the question is, was there a type? Yeah.
I mean, the idea is that most Galilean Jews spoke Aramaic at the time. I mean, you'd really have to be, a Jerusalem Jew to be using Hebrew on a regular basis, even in the first century. You're not interacting with other people with that language, even though it still existed.
It's like people who in Israel. There's a bunch of people who live in the religious communities who, between themselves, they speak Yiddish, but everywhere else they speak Hebrew.
Right.
Okay. But they would still speak Yiddish amongst themselves if they
went out. So a form of Middle German was the common language of Ashkenazi Jews, Yiddish.
Yeah. But no, it's just an example. The point is, would there have been literature specifically in Hebrew for all of the Jews who spoke primarily Hebrew?
It's fascinating that we don't have a Hebrew literature from Josephus or the Christians.
Yeah. Even though I might say, look, they can just speak Aramaic. Why even write? Or they know Greek or they know Aramaic. But
the best we can do is we can say that what we've got are Greek documents, both Christian documents and Josephus. What we have and what we know we have are Greek. And there may be an Aramaic Matthew, or there may be an Aramaic Josephus of the Jewish Wars, even the Antiquities. But standard scholarship consensus says we just don't have that material right now.
Yeah, it is a lacuna. Did I use that word right? A lacuna? Yeah.
Lacuna, gap, hole, right.
Yeah. You did. Yeah, at the same time.
So my thought is you've set me to do further research. So I am a natural skeptic. And even though you have given me some tempting ideas, Jacob, you're going to have to give me time to chew it and digest it thoroughly before I come to such a radical conclusion. Because let's face it, this would be an enormously radical conclusion. And by far the earliest text outside of, say, I mean, before, as I say, this would be about contrary to the traditional scholarly consensus dating from Mark, the oldest gospel. So this would be before the pseudo-epigrapha, before the other gospels. We have a reference in Josephus in a work written to the general public that details Jesus and John the Baptist in an astonishing way.
Well, then how far back would it really go? Is that
73, 74?
Yeah. Even before that, because he did that before the Greek one.
I believe that the Greek version of the Jewish Wars is 74, 75.
Yeah.
And that was in his Greek preface to that edition, saying that he'd already sent a version in his common language to the East. That would suggest at least a year or two earlier, right?
Yeah, I put it in 73.
He also describes the fall of Masada, which occurred in 73, even in the Slavonic edition. So that would mean if it's the Aramaic edition, the Aramaic edition have to come out sometime 73, 74, and the Jewish Wars in Greek 74, 75.
It's a lot of writing in a short time.
Well, he has a
I think he was writing them years in advance, and then he published them in those years.
Yeah, that makes sense.
On them.
And probably a year per
wouldn't that mean the destruction of Jerusalem was symbolic? Because it wouldn't have to be after the destruction of Jerusalem that he's writing about the destruction.
Be working on it from. In other words, he could start.
Well, he doesn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem in all volumes of the wars.
And the other thing he's talking about is
between
him and Vespasian in 68. So I don't believe he could have even begun taking pen to paper on the Jewish wars until, say, 70, when it looked like it was secure that Vespasian was emperor. At least 69. Before July of 69, it would be impossible in my mind, because that's when Vespasian made his bid for empire. Nothing would make sense to me in the Jewish war if that hasn't yet occurred. So the Jewish wars, in my mind, could only have started in their construction, even in note-taking and the idea of it, nascently, let's say, in 70 sometime. So the writing, 71, 72, 73, 74.
Yeah. So you're telling me that so if this is true, what you're saying is true, the Slavonic edition or the Aramic East edition is shorter and was done in 3 years, and the other took 5 years to complete, with 2 extra years for other events.
Well, as I say, this Aramaic or Slavonic, if it is, the Aramaic edition is too big. It looks to me to be a mere epitome of the work. It's actually that detailed to be a version of the work. On the other hand, seems to be somewhat abbreviated, leaving out material like Jacob pointed out. Some of it that seems to be consistently makes sense because it would offend the politics of Edessa, Rome's friends in the East.
How do you any
certain material to appease the politics of what later Christian would be appeasing the politics of first century Edessans? Another good point Jacob made.
Josephus.
If the missing reference, as you point out, to the rebel Edessans is truly political appeasement, it's first century appeasement. And so that's a strong, but that still doesn't mean that the parts about Jesus and John the Baptist were interpolations on top of the original Aramaic edition, which is exactly what some scholars have argued.
I like believing fantastic things, so I'm kind of buying it because this is cool.
Well,
we have to look at the evidence.
I know, but I like it.
Okay,
it gets me worried, but I like it.
An important point for me is that obviously, if were I to come to the conclusions that Jacob is coming to about the full testimonium in the Antiquities, as well as the Slavonic edition of the Jewish Wars, then it would be very convenient for the theory of Roman provenance.
Yeah.
It would be like some wild fantasy dream coming true for me of demonstrating the thesis I've already published. That is precisely why I have to be skeptical. My own cognitive biases, which would have me say, wow, wouldn't that be cool? As a demonstration that the Roman propagandist Josephus is so extensively in on this early telling of the Jesus story, would make him a Christian, in effect, if the testimonium is true. Raised on the third day, was the Christ, more than a man.
Well, especially if the testimony of Slavionum, if it were to be admitted to be authentic, because Josephus goes further in that version and says it is impossible to call him a man.
Right, he's a divine being. It's my opinion. He's a divine being.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which actually fits the theology of the Greeks and Easterners who believe he wasn't. But yeah,
I think we can end it here.
Slavonium wonders whether it's permissible to even call him a man.
I think we can end it here. I thank all of you for joining me tonight. And tomorrow I'll be doing a live stream interviewing Gary Greenberg.
Whoa!
Yep. We're going to be talking about the historical Exodus from his point of view. So don't miss it. And I'll see all of you later.
Take care.
And may the force be with you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.